This is a homily for the 11th Sunday in Ordinary Time. The Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 9, verse 36 to chapter 10, verse 8. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Today we return to the Sunday readings for Ordinary Time. Keep in mind that we are in Year A of the lectionary's 3-yearly cycle. Year A is the year of Matthew's Gospel. Most scholars today agree that when Matthew wrote his Gospel, he had a copy of Mark's Gospel open in front of him. The evidence is simply too consistent to ignore. Of Mark's 661 verses, around 606 find their way, often word for word, into Matthew. But Matthew is not a mere copyist. He is a careful editor and theologian. He tends to smooth out Mark's rougher Greek, tighten the narrative, and remove redundancies. Matthew retains Mark's overall narrative framework, which begins with a brief prelude, followed by an account of the Galilean ministry. Jesus then begins the journey to Jerusalem for the celebration of Passover. We then have a day-by-day account of the last week, culminating in the women going to the empty tomb on Easter Sunday morning. However, Matthew expands Mark significantly at both ends. He adds an infancy narrative that situates Jesus firmly within Israel's history, and he concludes with a resurrection appearance in Galilee, where the risen Lord commissions his disciples. The result is not simply a longer version of Mark, but a re-presented gospel, one that is structured, purposeful, and explicitly directed towards forming a community of disciples. Matthew places greater emphasis on the teaching of Jesus, grouping his sayings into 5 carefully constructed discourses, the first of which is the Sermon on the Mount. That is followed by missionary instructions. Then we have a collection of parables, which is followed by community instructions, and finally an eschatological discourse. Each of these 5 discourses ends with a similar concluding formula. Now, when Jesus had finished these words, instructing his 12 disciples, these parables, these words, all these words. Why has Matthew done this? Quite possibly because he wants us to think of the 5 scrolls of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the foundational books of Israel's life under God's law. In those 5 books, Moses is the one through whom God gives the law to his people. He ascends the mountain, receives the law, and hands it on. He is the great teacher of Israel. Matthew now presents Jesus in that same role, but with a decisive difference. Jesus does not simply receive the law, he gives it with authority. He does not say, "Thus says the Lord," as the prophets do. Instead he says, "But I say to you." The 5 great discourses in Matthew's Gospel echo the 5 books of Moses. It is as though Jesus is delivering a new and definitive Torah, not abolishing the old, but bringing it to fulfillment. Jesus, the new and greater Moses brings the law of Moses to its fulfillment. In today's Gospel, we heard the concluding words of chapter 9, and we began reading from chapter 10, which contains missionary instructions to the 12. The first great discourse in the Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount, instructed the disciples on who they must be and how they must live. They are to be salt and light. This second discourse in chapter 10 is directed more specifically to the 12, empowering them and instructing them for mission. At the end of chapter 9, we're told that Jesus made a tour through all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing all kinds of diseases and all kinds of illness. And when he saw the crowds, he felt sorry for them, because they were harassed and dejected, like sheep without a shepherd. Before we have a closer look at today's Gospel, I'd like to begin with some cautionary words from the biblical scholar John H. Walton. He reminds us that language assumes a culture, operates in a culture, serves a culture, and is designed to communicate into the framework of a culture. Consequently, when we read a text written in another language and addressed to another culture, we must translate the culture as well as the language, if we hope to understand the text fully. With that in mind, let us begin by asking what good news would have meant for the contemporaries of Jesus. Good news is a translation of the Greek word euangelion. The prefix epsilon upsilon means good, and angelion means message or announcement. We usually translate euangelion as gospel. Gospel comes from the Old English god spell, which is made up of god, which means good, and spell, which means story, message, news, or account. So god spell literally means good story or good news. This Old English word also carried the echo of God's news, not just good news in general, but news that comes from God and reveals God. In the Greco-Roman world, euangelion could be used in imperial proclamations, public announcements of world-shaping events such as imperial birthdays, the moment a new emperor came to power, or a decisive military victory. Events presented as the beginning of a new age. In the Jewish prophetic tradition, especially in Isaiah, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the one who brings good news. Isaiah chapter 52 verse 7. Good news meant God returning to his people to end exile, bring healing, establish justice, and reign as king. When Matthew says that Jesus proclaims the good news of the kingdom, he brings these two worlds together, the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world. In Jesus, God is acting decisively in history, fulfilling the hopes of Israel and announcing a reign that relativizes and challenges all earthly powers. For Matthew, the good news is the joyful announcement that in Jesus, God's long-promised kingdom has arrived, bringing restoration, healing, forgiveness, and the beginning of a new creation. Jesus proclaims good news of the kingdom, or basileia in the Greek. For Matthew, the kingdom is not a place we go to, but God's reign, God taking charge. It is God acting to set things right, to heal, to forgive, to restore, and to establish justice. In Jesus, that reign is already present and at work, but not yet brought to its full completion. When Jesus saw the crowds, how did he feel? Well, it depends on which translation you read. The Jerusalem Bible and the Revised New Jerusalem Bible tell us that he felt sorry for them. The New Revised Standard Version and the New International Version say that he had compassion. The New American Bible says Jesus was moved with pity, and Tom Wright's translation says he felt deeply sorry for them. None of these translations quite captures the physical force of the Greek verb that Matthew uses. Matthew uses the Greek verb splachnidzomai. That verb comes from the noun splankna. The noun splankna refers to the heart, lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines. In classical Greek, it refers to the seat of the deepest emotions. It is one of the most vivid and forceful words in Greek for expressing compassion, an experience of being inwardly shaken. What makes this verb so distinctive is not simply its intensity, but its bodily, visceral character, compassion that is felt physically. It means that one is really churned up inside. Jesus is not simply observing the crowd or feeling sorry for them. He is moved in the depths of his being, right down to his very guts. This is compassion that grips him, disturbs him, and compels him to act. So, he is moved to the very depths of his being. A verb such as splachnidzomai would have been almost unthinkable in the Greco-Roman world if applied to a divine being. Whether in the philosophical tradition, where the divine is incapable of suffering, self-sufficient, untouched by emotion, or in the popular religion, where the gods may act but are not inwardly moved by human suffering. There is no place for a deity who is viscerally moved by compassion. By way of contrast, the scriptures of Israel are entirely unafraid to speak of God as deeply, even intensely moved in relation to his people. The key Hebrew term here is rachamim, often translated compassion or mercy, and related to rechem, the word for womb. This is not abstract benevolence, it is a profoundly personal, almost maternal kind of compassion. In passages like Hosea chapter 11, God speaks in language that is startlingly close to emotional upheaval. My heart recoils within me, my compassion grows warm and tender. Likewise, in Isaiah chapter 49 verse 15, the comparison is made explicitly with a mother's love for the child of her womb. What Matthew does in attributing splachnidzomai to Jesus is to take that scriptural tradition and give it visible expression in him. What in the Old Testament is spoken of in metaphorical or poetic language about God is now made visible in the actions of Jesus. The comparison of God is no longer simply declared, it is seen, enacted, and encountered in a human life. So, While a verb such as splachnizomai would not have been as alien in a Jewish context as in a Greco-Roman one, its application to Jesus still carries enormous weight. It is not merely saying that Jesus feels deeply. It is identifying his visceral compassion with the very compassion of God himself, as Israel had come to know him. Matthew then tells us why Jesus is so deeply moved. When he looks at the crowds, he does not simply see a large number of people, he perceives their true condition. They are, as Matthew tells us, harassed and dejected, like sheep without a shepherd. When Matthew tells us this, he is not giving us a gentle rural image. He is drawing on the language of the Old Testament, especially Ezekiel chapter 34, where God condemns the leaders of Israel as false shepherds who have failed to care for the flock, leaving the sheep scattered, vulnerable, and exposed. The tragedy is not that the people have no leaders, but that their leaders have failed them. Seeing this, Jesus is moved in the depths of his being. Jesus takes upon himself the very role that God had claimed in Ezekiel. I myself will shepherd my sheep. In other words, in Jesus, God himself has come to shepherd his people. This moment at the end of chapter 9 is not simply a description of what Jesus feels, it becomes the turning point for what he does next. The compassion of Jesus leads directly to action. The need is great. The harvest is plentiful, but the labourers are few. And so as we move into chapter 10, Jesus responds by calling the 12, equipping them and sending them out into the harvest. The 12, who up to this point in the Gospel have been mathetai, learners, are now called and sent forth. They become apostoloi, or apostles. The noun mathetai comes from the verb mathano, which means to learn, and apostoloi comes from the verb apostello, which means to send forth with authority and purpose. But before sending the 12 forth, Jesus first calls them. The verb that Matthew uses is proskoleo, which means to summon into one's presence. This verb does not mean a casual calling, but a summons that is deliberate and with authority. It is formed from pros, towards, and kaleo, to call. It conveys the sense of Jesus drawing the 12 into his own presence with purpose. He does not merely gather them, he summons them with authority, bringing them close in order to entrust them with his mission. This verb marks a decisive moment. Those who have been following him are now personally summoned, placed before him, and prepared to be sent. Those who are apostles are first summoned and then sent forth. Let me reflect for a moment on the idea of being sent forth. The Austrian psychiatrist Viktor Frankl reminds us that there is a difference between the call from within and the call from outside. It is the difference between ambition and vocation. Ambition comes from the self. Vocation from something outside and larger than the self. Being human is always directed and pointing to something or someone other than oneself, to a meaning to fulfill or another human being to encounter, a cause to serve or a person to love. At this year's Holy Chrism Mass, Pope Leo XIV spoke about being sent. We know that being sent entails, first and foremost, a detachment. That is, the risk of leaving behind what is familiar and certain in order to venture into something new. We follow Jesus, who did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. Every mission begins with that kind of self-emptying in which everything is reborn. But we are often reluctant to respond to the call. In Tolkien's modern classic The Hobbit, there is an amusing scene between Gandalf and Bilbo Baggins. Gandalf tells Bilbo Baggins that he is looking for someone to share in an adventure that he's arranging, but he's finding it very difficult to find anyone. "I should think so, in these parts," replies Bilbo. "We are plain, quiet folk, and have no use for adventures. Nasty, disturbing, uncomfortable things make you late for dinner. I can't see what anybody sees in them." Left to ourselves, we would all prefer a quiet life. But the gospel does not begin with our preference. It begins with the call of Jesus, and those whom he summons, he sends. Jesus summons 12 disciples. What is the significance of the number 12? The beginning of Israel's history lay in God's choice of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the forebears of a special nation. Through Jacob in particular, God formed for himself a people made up of 12 tribes, offspring of the 12 patriarchs, the sons of Jacob, whom God renamed Israel. But what becomes of the 12 tribes? New Testament scholar John Mayer explains, "In his own person, King David welded the 12 tribes into a united kingdom about 1000 BC, but rebellion tore that apart. Under David's grandson Rehoboam, the kingdom split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah in 922 BC. In the 8th century, the Assyrians invaded and destroyed the northern kingdom in 721 BC. In the biblical version of this history, the 10 northern tribes were exiled and never returned to their land. In the 6th century, Babylon invaded and overthrew the southern kingdom of Judah in 587 BC. And so, for a while, the nation of Israel seemed extinguished. Within half a century, though, some of the exiles from the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi began returning to the former southern kingdom to start the rebuilding of Jerusalem in 538 BC. Despite the great hopes of prophets like 2nd and 3rd Isaiah, the restoration of Jerusalem and its temple was paltry and disappointing. Not surprisingly, Jews began to look forward in faith to a future in which God would gather all 12 tribes back to a restored, promised land. According to many prophecies, at the end of days, Yahweh would recreate his people Israel as a whole. So Jesus' choice of an inner circle of 12 disciples must be understood within the context of Israel's overarching hope for the regathering of all Israel, of all 12 tribes. New Testament scholar Tom Wright puts it this way. The number 12 is itself, of course, full of meaning, as anyone in Jesus' world would recognize. At the heart of what Jesus was up to was his belief that through his work, God was at last renewing and restoring Israel, which traditionally had been based upon the 12 tribes. But now the 12 were not just to be a sign that God was restoring Israel, they were to be part of the means by which he was doing so. Let me conclude by making an important observation about the 12 disciples that Jesus chose and whom Matthew names in today's Gospel. Jesus didn't choose disciples who were all of like mind. Consider, for example, the choice of Simon the Canaanian and Matthew the tax collector. Let's look firstly at Simon. He's called the Canaanian in the Gospels of Mark and Matthew, and he's called Simon the Zealot in Luke's Gospel. The Greek word zealotes is a translation of the Aramaic word kanan, which means zealous. The Greek word Kananios is a transliteration of the Aramaic, which is rendered in English as Canaan. So, whether he is called Canaan or Zealot, both names point to the same thing. Simon is the zealous one. So, who were the Zealots? The Jewish biblical scholar Shea Cohen explains, the Zealots first appear, except for 3 stray references in Josephus, in the events of 67 CE, and consisted for the most part of peasants who fled to Jerusalem as the Romans swept southward from Galilee. The Zealots removed the aristocratic high priest and with equal intensity attacked other revolutionary groups, the aristocracy and the Romans. But our Simon lived some 30 years before that, so it's hopelessly anachronistic to turn him into a member of an organised group of ultra-nationalist freedom fighters who took up arms against the occupying forces of Rome. John Mayer explains what the term means when applied to Simon. The evangelist's attribution of the name Zealot or Canaan to Simon reflects an older and broader use of the term Kanana, a Jew who was intensely zealous for the practice of the Mosaic law and insistent that his fellow Jews strictly observe the law as a means of distinguishing and separating Israel, God's holy people, from the idolatry and immorality practiced by neighbouring Gentiles. Simon's call to discipleship and then to membership in the 12 demanded a fundamental change in his outlook and behaviour. In one way or another, this was true for all of the 12. But in Simon's case, the change must have been especially jarring. After all, Jesus not only mixed with, but even shared table fellowship with those regarded as the religious lowlife of his own people within Israel. People like the toll collectors and sinners, people like Matthew, men who collaborated with the Roman occupation, collecting taxes on its behalf, and thereby profiting from a system many Jews regarded as oppressive and unclean. For someone marked by zeal for God and for the integrity of his people, such association would have been unthinkable. So let's turn to Matthew the tax collector, or more accurately, the toll collector. What was the role of toll collectors? The Greek word that Matthew's Gospel uses is telones. To understand the role of the toll collector, we need to begin with Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Herod Antipas would have paid a fixed annual tribute to the emperor. He also funded a number of infrastructure projects and maintained a lavish personal lifestyle. The revenue for all of this was raised through taxation. Those who collected certain taxes on Herod's behalf were known as architoloni, or senior toll collectors. By means of a public auction, they purchased from Herod's government the right to collect indirect taxes, such as tolls and customs, in a given district. They were obliged to pay a determined amount to Herod, and anything over and above that was theirs to keep. Conversely, if they were not able to reach the specified amount, they had to make up the shortfall from their own resources. Historians estimate that there were likely between 5 and 10 architoloni serving Herod Antipas in his territories of Galilee and Perea. The architoloni engaged the services of teloni, such as Matthew. They were local agents responsible for collecting the taxes on goods in transit and, in practice, free to add their own surcharge. Architolones would have overseen a staff of several dozen teloni to manage a major district like Jericho or Capernaum. Here you can see Matthew at his toll booth. To protect the large amounts of cash and enforce the squeeze on reluctant merchants, the booth was often flanked by Herodian soldiers or private enforcers, as you can see here. Each telones operated under a fixed quota, owed to the architolones. He had to hand over that agreed sum in full, and whatever he could collect above it became his income. So the system itself encouraged overcharging. Now, set that alongside Simon. One is marked by zeal for God and for the integrity of Israel. The other is embedded in a system that serves the Roman occupation and profits from it. Under normal circumstances, these two men would have had nothing to do with one another. So Jesus didn't choose disciples who were all of like mind. Within the 12 there is Simon, a zealot for the law, and Matthew, one regarded as a public sinner. And yet Jesus calls them both. They will have to learn to live together, because the kingdom that Jesus proclaims was not for one group within Israel, but for all. That is not just an incidental detail in the gospel. It is a challenge to us. Because we too tend to gather with those who think as we do, see as we do, and judge as we do. But the church is built on the call of Christ, not on those whom I would choose. And that is the real test of discipleship, not following Jesus on my own terms, but remaining with those he has also called, even when they are not the kind of person that I would have chosen myself.